Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. Today, we are doing it old school Season 1 style. Instead of a biography or a profile of a character like I've been doing recently, I'm going to discuss an old school conspiracy theory while completely plastered, and then I am going to completely tear down that conspiracy theory with facts and logic, while being even more drunk. It's been a long time since I've done an episode like this, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it. So today we are discussing a conspiracy theory involving the man, the legend, the bard himself, William Shakespeare. Now, William Shakespeare, he's one of my favorite playwrights of all time. I'm sure he's a lot of people's favorite playwright of all time. And sometimes if I get drunk enough, I can recite his plays from memory. That's how much I have read his works. So we're probably already asking ourselves a conspiracy theory about Shakespeare. What could that possibly look like? Well, what if I were to tell you that Shakespeare never penned a single one of his plays or sonnets? And what if I were to further go on to tell you that Shakespeare was an illiterate backwoods hillbilly who was basically used as a front man by a group of educated, enlightened authors of the late Elizabethan and early Jacobean age who had to write under the pseudonym because their works were considered controversial or a little too forward-thinking for the time? Well, there's a group of people out there who believe just this. They're called the anti-Stratfordians, and they're basically a group of uppity, white, middle-class, upper-class pricks who have been pushing this idea since the mid to late Victorian age. And a lot of people still believe in this conspiracy theory today that Shakespeare was just a name, a face to put on these works by these various authors. And the mental gymnastics they'll use in order to, quote, prove, end quote, this theory or these series of hypotheses is astounding. But I'm rushing ahead of ourselves. Let's get into the bare basics, and as always, we're gonna start right at the beginning with Shakespeare's life. Now, to be honest, I was too lazy this time around to actually read a biography about Shakespeare, but I'm not gonna dive too deep into the details about his life because the conspiracy theory doesn't really dive too deep into the details about his life, and to be honest, we actually don't know a whole lot about the details of his life. The records are from the 16th century and they are very scant. However, the lack of records detailing literally every little thing about this guy's life will be used against him in this theory. So this story actually starts in the 1500s with Shakespeare's father, a man named John Shakespeare. He was a businessman and local politician in the small market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, about 100 miles northwest of London. And this was considered like a backwoods rural hick town, and it was generally assumed that everybody from this town was basically illiterate or dumb or whatever. But Shakespeare's dad, he was actually pretty savvy and pretty well off. He served as an alderman, a bailiff, a chief magistrate on the town council, and he was actually mayor of Stratford in 1568. So the dude was basically working in local government, which is really cool, as well as doing the leather trade as his job as a glover. The guy was a hustler and he was able to do very well for himself as well as his 8 kids. He actually does so well that before his death, he's actually granted a coat of arms and allowed to call himself Master or Mr. or whatever. It doesn't really mean anything today, but in England in this time, it was kind of like an honorific title. It was a thing saying like, hey man, you made it. So John basically marries this chick named Mary Arden, who's kind of part of the local gentry. And old Bill, the bard William, he's actually their 3rd child. He was born in 1564. Now, one thing a lot of these anti-Stratfordists or conspiracy theorists will say, they'll say that the father and the mother were illiterate. And this is mostly due to the fact that instead of writing out their name on like documents or stuff, they'd usually sign with a mark or an X. And they actually say the same thing about Shakespeare's siblings and daughters later in life. life, which these anti-Straffordists usually believe give more weight to their theory that Shakespeare was illiterate. But they forget one thing. The thing is, like, writing and reading are two different skill sets. Although they are combined, they are two different skill sets. Because a lot of people forget that just because you can't write or have very poor handwriting doesn't mean that you cannot read. And these conspiracy theorists believe that just because William and his father and most of his family had very poor handwriting or would sign things with just a mark meant that they were illiterate. Well, that's not true at all. They were probably perfectly literate. However, they probably weren't very good at writing. And I'm actually aware of this from my own personal experience, because if you were to look at my handwriting, especially my signature, you would think that I was some illiterate hillbilly boob who didn't know anything about reading or whatever. But the actual fact is, I just have very poor handwriting thanks to college shorthand. I'm actually a very prolific reader. Well, it's mostly due to college shorthand because I wrote a lot of notes in college when I was doing my classes or whatever. You know, laptops weren't really a thing yet. I mean, they were a thing, but they were very expensive, and even though I have one, they were very bulky, and I'm not the best typer, so I took a lot of notes by hand. And at one point, for like half a quarter, like 6 weeks, my wrist was actually in an ace bandage from when I sprained it from falling down the stairs of this ghetto place I was living in, that it permanently altered my handwriting to look like illiterate scrawl, because even though my hand was in an ace bandage, I still had to take notes when I attended class. But what I'm basically saying is, Shakespeare and his family, they really had this scrawl when it came especially to their signatures, and they usually had other people writing their documents for them, because writing and reading are two different skills, and a lot of people who don't understand that, they think that that was a symbol that the family was illiterate. Would he really be illiterate? Yeah, he probably isn't the best at writing, but he's not going to be illiterate. And a lot of people think Shakespeare was illiterate because he was from kind of this backwoods hillbilly town of only like 1,500 people. But old Bill, he was actually from a family that was one of the better off people of this town, and the fact that they simply had a school just blocks from his house that was free that he attended is more than proof that the dude is not illiterate. Maybe he sucked at handwriting, but like that doesn't mean he's illiterate. And that is like a major point that these people would bring up when they say that Shakespeare didn't write his own plays. They would say he's illiterate. Well, I already blew that out of the water, because the dude totally went to this school and he was being taught basically literature. Now, like handwriting, it wasn't really codified at the time, so it's all over the place, and a lot of these people will say, well, this handwriting doesn't match this, and this spelling doesn't match this, and this spelling doesn't match this. Well, spelling wasn't uniform in England at the time. Shakespeare, when he was writing his plays, he probably wrote down the same word in like 3 or 4 different variations, because spelling wasn't really a thing during this time. It was kind of made up as how you sound or how you hear it. And to be honest, I forgot until just now how fun these are to do when I am just totally drunk and just ranting and not editing it and just going on and on. So like Shakespeare, he's growing up in this backwoods like hillbilly town, and he's actually part of like the upper class of this town. I mean, his dad was the freaking mayor at some point. So like, dude, you've got some privilege there. And he's going to this school, which is literally free. Why wouldn't you go to this school? So that basic matter of fact just blows that conspiracy theory out of the water. We know for a fact that this dude was literate. Hell, even his vocabulary was calculated to be up to 29,000 words. That is better than my own personal vocabulary, and I do a fucking podcast for a living. But since no letters, like personal letters or documents or anything from his life survive, these people, these conspiracy theorists, they take that as evidence that he was illiterate. That really states what is going on, because this theory really comes up in the 19th century amongst the aristocratic Victorians who decide, hey, Shakespeare, he's the greatest guy of all time, and we should make him our like national playwright or whatever. But they can't fathom the thought that some basically backwards idiot from some low-class town 150 miles away from the aristocracy of London or whatever could produce such genius prose that lives on forever. I mean, hell, I'm talking about it right now, and I believe that that is genius prose. And that idea is the same idea as like some Hollywood producer or some guy on like SNL who's like writing for SNL in New York or whatever, stating that, you know, some guy from West Virginia or Kentucky or Ohio is just some idiot who wouldn't know how to create great dialogue in a show or a play or a movie or whatever. It's that same idea, and it's a very classist idea. And that's where we see this theory really start arising. It's amongst that aristocracy of Victorian England. And it's mostly what we would call the modern aristocracy, these rich white guys which perpetuate it today. They can't believe that some backwoods guy from some backwoods town could be such a genius. But then the plays, let's look at the plays. Now, a lot of people who ascribe to this conspiracy theory state that there's no real consistency with his plays because he did everything from dramas to comedies to tragedies to whatever. So obviously it had to have been written by different people. And one of the main plays they'll point out in this fact is Titus Andronicus. And since Titus Andronicus is such a brutal play, it's filled with like death and mutilation and sets and crazy humor, and it really stands out amongst Shakespeare's plays as its own kind of thing. They think that that was actually written by somebody else. And to be honest, when I first heard about this theory, I thought, that does make sense. It is a very violent play. It's filled with really crass humor, and it's even filled with more murders than any other play. What's going on here? And when it was written very early in his supposed career, and it was written anonymously. But then again, when he wrote it when he was very young, and it's written almost like a Quentin Tarantino film, which kind of makes sense because what young guy in his 20s or early 30s doesn't absolutely love Quentin Tarantino films? Hell, I'm 37 and I still think Quentin Tarantino films are fucking awesome because they are. And if that director were to ever make another film, I would suggest making Titus Andronicus. I would love to see Quentin Tarantino's version of Titus Andronicus. That would be freaking awesome, because that play is freaking brutal, and it actually has one of the best, most iconic lines to ever come out of any Shakespearean play. And I quote, "Villain, what hast thou done? That which thou canst not undo. Thou hast undone our mother? Villain, I have done thy mother." And you know what? Those prick, cloistered, puritanical Victorians actually deleted that iconic line from that play in an 1898 copy of the complete works of Shakespeare. You know how I know that? Because I own that very copy, and in a drunken stupor, I was reading through it and quoting it word from word, and I noticed that those lines were missing, and I actually remember scrawling them into the book. And M, my former wife, she was like, "What are you doing? Why are you writing in that antique book?" And I said, "These pricks left out these iconic lines," and I was scrawling them in the footnotes and just ranting about the fact that how can these people delete lines from this play like this, but I digress. So Titus Andronicus is a brutal, bloody play about revenge, and it doesn't really fit in with the other plays that Shakespeare does. So a lot of people thought that that was written by another author, but being a fan of that genre, just being a guy, to be honest, who's lived through his 20s and 30s, I can see what he was doing. You know, he was in his early 20s and 30s, and what appeals to guys in their early 20s and 30s? Violence. So yeah, it was an early play, and that was just his style at the time. It was his almost Quentin Tarantino phase. But that's like the primary play that they point to when they point out that, oh no, he didn't write all his plays or any of his plays, it was a bunch of other writers. They always point out Titus Andronicus. They're also really quick to point out plays like Richard III or whatever, and they would say, well, how would a backwoods hillbilly from, you know, some little market town in the middle of nowhere that's just known for like slaughtering sheep or whatever know about court etiquette and stuff? And it's like, dude, it didn't matter where you were from in England, you probably were taught at some point what court etiquette was. Because at the end of the day, court etiquette, it's just basic general etiquette at the end of the day. But where this really breaks down is they just simply keep citing a lack of literary evidence because the original copies of Shakespeare's works have been lost. His handwritten plays have been lost. Now those folios exist and they are a little bit post-contemporary, but they say, oh, they're filled with ciphers and all this other crazy stuff that state that it was like Sir Francis Bacon or whatever his name was, and all these other writers who weren't even playwrights, who didn't even know how to write a play. They were just writers, and they will do all these mental gymnastics to say that it was this guy, not this guy. They've actually listed like 80 different candidates for who Shakespeare could be, but at the end of the day, like, the dude was just the dude from Stratford-upon-Avon. And the people who generally subscribe to this conspiracy theory just think that a man with this background couldn't possibly become the great bard, and they cite the lack of evidence as that fact. And the great logical fallacy is they believe that lack of evidence is evidence of the fact that he didn't write these plays and sonnets, and that is simply insanity. There are contemporaries that state that he was the author of these plays and these sonnets. And at the end of the day, it's actually the ignorant aristocracy who's just trying to put their authority on things. And we all know about the ignorance of the aristocracy. Those rich old guys, they're usually the dumbest, out-of-touch idiots in the world. I mean, if you work for any kind of corporation, you know. I mean, have you seen those reels and memes about corporate math? That's not made up. That is how these out-of-touch idiots think. And it's the same way that these idiots who believe in this theory think. They think that just because he came from some small town and had these dealings in like real estate and stuff and didn't have the best handwriting, that he's just some idiot. But that is not true. But fortunately for us, most Shakespearean historians and people who just generally love Shakespeare have not accepted this insane fringe theory. And they see old Bill as the genius that he was, and he truly was a genius. The dude literally created genres and formulas that we follow to this very day when we create television shows and plays and whatnot. The guy literally invented words that we use in the English language every day, and he was able to keep in touch with the common man because most of the people who were listening to his shows and going to his shows were the common people. It was made for the common people. And yes, you can say there is propaganda there. Richard III is obvious Tudor or Elizabethan propaganda, but being a man of his time, of course he's gonna create some Tudor propaganda. The guy's not dumb enough to piss off his queen. So what do I think of this conspiracy theory? I think it is all bunk. I think it is garbage. Shakespeare did exist. He was a man. He wrote some of the greatest plays of all time, as well as some of the greatest sonnets, and it has finally come after a year and a half of doing this and this idea. I am finally going to do some drunk Shakespeare for y'all. But before I really get into it, I do truly want to thank the ones who suggested this episode. I have been actually planning this episode since day 0. I just never really knew how to approach it, and I figured that after a year of doing this show, I would just get really wasted and just rant about it. Because this is a conspiracy theory that is very personal to me. I do really idolize Shakespeare as a great playwright, and as a person who has actually performed Shakespeare in his life, I do hold his content near and dear to my heart. I have literally spent my entire life studying this guy, and I will defend him until my dying breath. I do not believe in this conspiracy at all, and I will trash it every chance I get. So from the absolute bottom of my heart, I do truly thank you people who did suggest this idea to me, because it's an idea idea that I had, and I wasn't really sure if I was gonna do it unless I got a lot of requests for it, and I did, and that was awesome. And to be honest, this idea was actually submitted to me from mostly you Brits out there who are listening. If you don't know, you guys are like 13% of my listening audience right now, and you guys always come up with some of the coolest suggestions for me to look into. So when this was recommended to me, I knew I had to dive onto it at some point, especially considering I really wanted to dive into this conspiracy theory since the podcast was even a thing. It was originally on my list of like top 10 things, and then when you guys suggested it, I was like, dude, I gotta slot that in somewhere. But on that note, I am gonna end it here. Well, not really, because I am finally at that point of drunk where I think I can do some drunk Shakespeare, which I've been wanting to do on this podcast for years. So here you go, you're gonna hear it live, unedited and raw, right from me right now. So let's start with let's do Act 1, Scene 2. No, Act 2, Scene 1 from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Puck. How now, spirit, whither wander you? Fairy, over hill, over there, through bush, through briar, over park, over pale, through flood, through fire. I do wander everywhere, swifter than the moon's sphere, and I serve the fairy queen, to do her orbs upon the green. The cowslips tall her pensioners be, in their gold coast spots you see. Those be rubies fairy favors, in those freckles live their saviors. I must go seek some dewdrops here, and hang a pearl in every cowslip's ear. Farewell, thou lob of spirits, I be gone. Our queen and our elves come here and on. And then Puck says a bunch of stuff, but I could still remember that, so hell yeah. Okay, my memory's getting a little fuzzy on that. How about Act 3, Scene 1, I think it is, of Julius Caesar, and I'm just gonna go like somewhere in the middle. O Caesar, hence wilt thou lift up Olympius? Great Caesar, doth not Brutus bootless kneel? Speak hands for me. Et tu, Brute, then fall Caesar. Liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead. Run hence, proclaim, cry it about the streets. Some to the common pulpits and cry out, liberty, freedom, and enfranchisement. People and senators, be not affrighted, fly not, stand stiff, ambitious, debt is paid. Go to the pulpit, Brutus, and Cassius too. Where, Publius? Here, quite confounded with this mutiny, stand fast together, lest some friend of Caesar should chance. Talk not of standing, Publius, I can't remember his name. I'm too drunk. Good cheer, there is no harm intended to your person, nor to no Roman else. So tell them, Publius, and leave us, Publius, lest that the people rushing on us should do your age some mischief. Do so, and let no man abide this deed, but we the doers. And, let's like the death of Caesar, Okay, let's do another one. This is Act 5, Scene 8 from the infamous play that shall not be named. Fuck it. I don't care about the bad luck thing. It's Macbeth. Why should I play the Roman fool and die on my own sword, whilst I see lives, the gashes, do better upon them? Turn, hellhound, turn. Of all men else I have avoided thee, but get thee back, my soul is too much charged with blood of thine already. I have no words, my voice is in my sword, thou bloodier villain than terms can give out. Thou loosest labor, as easy mayest thou the internchent, if I remember that correctly, air. With thy keen sword impress me and make me bleed. Let thy blade fall on venerable crests. I bear a charm life which must not yield to one of woman born. I don't remember what Macduff says at this point, but it's basically C-section, bitch, I'm gonna fuck you up. Despair thy charm, and let the angel whom thou still hast served tell thee Macduff was formed his woman mother's womb untimely ripped. I got it. And let the angel whom thou still hast served tell thee Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. C-section, bitch. That's basically what it was. Accursed be that tongue that tells me so, for it hath cowed my better part of man. And be these juggling friends no more believed, that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope. I'll not fight with thee. Then yield thee, coward, and live to be the show and gaze of the time. We'll have thee, as rarer monsters are, painted on a pole and under wit. Here may you see the tyrant. I will not yield to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet and be baited with rabble's curse through Burnham would come to Dunsannon. I could never say that word. Dunsane. I don't remember. And thou opposed, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last before my body. I throw my warlike shield, lay on Macduff, and damned be him that first cries, hold enough. And then they fight and blah 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 blah, and like Macbeth dies, and that's like the end of the play, and it's freaking awesome. And to be honest, I think like Sir Patrick Stewart plays in like a version of it in 2012. It's set in the modern day and it's freaking epic, and you should watch that. And one of my favorite little quotes from Shakespeare, this one comes from Twelfth Night. If music be the food of love, play on, give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die, that strain again it had a dying fall. Oh, it came o'er my ear like the sweet sound that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing in given odor, enough no more. 'Tis not so sweet now as it was before. O spirit of love, how quick and fresh art thou, that notwithstanding thy capacity receiveth as the sea not enters there. Of what validity and put soe'er, but falls into abatement and low price, even in a minute so full of shapes is fancy, that it alone is high fantastical. So yeah, that's some quotes from Shakespeare while I am completely zonked drunk on this delicious Voodoo Juice Force IPA. This stuff is like 9.5% alcohol, and I had 2 pints of it while doing this, so yeah. And like I said, I am not going to edit this. I may cut out some of the long pauses, but that's about it. That was my little rant about Shakespeare. And as always, I thank you for listening. If you did like this episode, I do ask that you just simply tell a friend. That is the primary #1 way this show does expand. And if you really liked it for whatever reason, go ahead and hit that support this podcast link and send me a little bit of money. You guys really have no idea how far that goes. On that note, I will see you in the next one.